She didn't sell herself for money. She sold herself to save the only man who ever called her his daughter, a broken man who gambled away everything, including her future. The debt was $3 million. The creditor was a Korean crime lord who had never once asked twice, and the deal on the table wasn't a payment plan. It was a marriage contract with her name already printed on the line. Amara Okoye was 28 years old, a school teacher from Chicago's South Side, and she had exactly 48 hours to decide whether freedom was worth more than her father's life. She signed on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, she was on a plane to Seoul. She never looked back, because looking back would have broken her completely. This is the story of what happened when a woman traded her liberty for love she never planned to find, and the price she paid to finally come home. Like this video, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me until the very end. You won't want to miss what happens next. The call came at 2:14 in the morning. Amara knew it was bad before she even touched the phone. Her father only called that late when something had already gone wrong. Not when it was still going wrong, not when there was still time to stop it, but when the damage was done, and the rubble was already settling, and all that was left was the counting of what had been lost. She lay in the dark of her apartment on the third floor of a building on West 63rd Street, staring at the water stain on her ceiling that she had been meaning to report to the landlord for 4 months, and she let it ring 3 times before she answered. "Daddy." The silence on the other end told her everything. Not the silence of a bad connection, the silence of a man trying to find language for something that didn't have good language. She sat up, pulled her knees to her chest. The radiator knocked and hissed in the corner. Outside, a car alarm went off 2 blocks away and then stopped just as fast. "Amara." His voice was scraped raw, like he had been crying for hours or trying not to. "I need you to come home." "It's 2 in the morning, Daddy. What happened?" Another pause. She heard him breathe, slow and unsteady, the way he breathed when he was trying to hold himself together and not quite managing it. James Okoye was 61 years old and had worked 32 years driving city buses for the Chicago Transit Authority. He was a man who fixed his own plumbing and kept his shoes polished and called her every Sunday at noon, and never, in her entire life, had asked her for anything he couldn't name plainly and directly. She had always loved that about him. It made what came next worse. "I'm in trouble," he said. "Real trouble. The kind I can't talk about on the phone." She was dressed and in a cab within 12 minutes. He lived in the same house in Englewood where she had grown up. A narrow 2-story with aluminum siding gone gray and a porch where he still kept her mother's rocking chair even though her mother had been dead for 11 years. The front light was on. Every other window in the house was dark. When she let herself in with her key, she found him sitting at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface in front of him, as if he needed to hold the table down or hold himself to the table. She couldn't tell which. There was a glass of water he hadn't touched. There was an envelope. He looked smaller than she remembered. She had seen him 3 weeks ago at Sunday dinner, and he had looked fine. Now he looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single night, the skin under his eyes bruised with exhaustion, his hands trembling in a way she had never seen before. She sat down across from him. "Tell me," she said. He told her. It had started 2 years ago, a little at a time, the way these things always started. Small enough to feel manageable, slow enough that you didn't notice the accumulation until the weight was unbearable. A card game with friends, then a casino trip to Indiana, then online, where the games never closed and the stakes climbed quietly and no one was there to look at you and ask if you were sure. He had won, at first. That was the thing about gambling. It gave you enough early wins to make you believe the pattern was real, that you had some edge or instinct that other men lacked. He had won $3,000 one weekend and taken her out to dinner to celebrate and not told her what the money was from. Then he had started losing. Not all at once. Not in a single catastrophic night. Slowly, then faster still, the way water accelerates as it gets closer to the drain. His savings went. Then his pension contributions, borrowed against. Then a second mortgage on the house that her mother had spent 30 years helping to pay off. He had borrowed from cousins and old friends and told himself each time that it was temporary, that the next run would be different, that he just needed to get back to even. He never got back to even. And then, 14 months ago, through a chain of connections he couldn't fully explain without his voice breaking, A man at the casino, a private game in a back room downtown, the kind of room you only got invited to if someone vouched for you. He had found himself sitting across from men who had money to lose and patience to extend credit and absolutely no mercy when the bill came due. The total, with interest compounded in a manner no legitimate institution would recognize, was $3,200,000. Amara sat completely still while he talked. She did not interrupt him. She did not cry. She watched his face and listened to his words and felt something harden behind her sternum, some protective mechanism engaging the way it had engaged when her mother was dying and she had needed to hold herself together long enough to be useful. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her. Her nails were painted deep burgundy. She noticed this because she needed somewhere neutral to look while her father told her he had destroyed himself. When he finished, the kitchen was very quiet. "Who are they?" she asked. He pushed the envelope across the table. Inside was a single card. Black matte stock, no logo, just a name in silver print. Kang Capital Group, Seoul. A phone number beneath it, and below the phone number, in handwriting that was precise and unhurried, a single line. "We will contact your family directly if we do not hear from you by Friday." Today was Wednesday. "Korean?" she said. "The men I played with were Korean American. The money traces back to Seoul." I looked up the name. He stopped. "Amara, these aren't debt collectors. They're not going to garnish wages. You understand what I'm telling you." She understood. She put the card back in the envelope, folded the flap, set it flat on the table between them. "How long have you known it was this bad?" 6 months, he said. "I kept thinking I'd find a way. 6 months." She didn't let anger into her voice. There was no room for anger right now. "You sat on this for 6 months." "I was ashamed." His voice cracked on the last word. He pressed his lips together and looked away from her, at the dark window over the sink. "I'm ashamed. I know that doesn't help anything." "No," she said quietly. "It doesn't." She stayed until 4 in the morning. She went through his finances, what remained of them, with the same systematic calm she brought to grading papers and organizing lesson plans, because that was the only way she knew to function under pressure. The picture was as bad as he had described, maybe worse. There was nothing. The house had equity, but not nearly enough. His pension was borrowed against beyond recovery. Her own savings were $47,000, which she had been building for years toward a down payment on something of her own, and against $3 million it was a gesture, nothing more. She drove home in the gray pre-dawn, the city just starting to stir around her, delivery trucks and early shift workers moving through the pale light, and she sat in her parked car outside her building for 23 minutes without going inside. Then she took out the black card and dialed the number. It rang once. "Miss Okoye," said the voice on the other end. Male, Korean accented English, perfectly calm. "We expected your call." She closed her eyes. "I want to meet." "Tomorrow," the voice said. "We'll send an address." She barely slept. She called in a personal day to the school, the first unplanned day she had taken in 3 years, and spent the morning sitting at her kitchen table drinking coffee she couldn't taste and thinking through every angle with the methodical focus that had gotten her through college, on a partial scholarship and a second job, through a graduate education degree completed while working full-time, through 11 years of teaching in a school where the resources were thin and the needs of her students were not. She was not a woman who fell apart easily. She had learned early that falling apart was a luxury, and she had never been able to afford it. The address arrived at noon. A downtown hotel, a specific floor, a room number. She dressed carefully. Dark slacks, a structured blazer, flat shoes. She did her hair pulled back and her face plain. She was not going there to be impressive or appealing. She was going to understand what she was dealing with. The hotel was the kind of place that had marble floors and staff who moved so quietly you almost didn't register them. She rode the elevator to the 31st floor and walked down a carpeted corridor that smelled of cedar and cool air and found the door. She knocked before she could think about it too hard. The man who opened the door was not what she had expected. She had constructed a mental image on the cab ride over, broad, aggressive, obviously threatening in the way of movie villains. What she found instead was a man in his mid-30s, lean and composed, wearing a charcoal suit that had been made specifically for his body. He had a face that was still and watchful rather than expressive, dark eyes that took her in without any of the leering she had steeled herself against. He was handsome in the way of someone who had no awareness of it or interest in it. He stepped back and held the door without speaking. She walked in. There were two other men in the room, stationed near the windows, not seated, wearing the careful neutrality of men paid to observe and wait. She registered them and dismissed them. Her attention stayed on the one who had opened the door, who crossed to a chair at the suite's conference table and sat, and gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. He studied her for a moment without speaking, not sizing her up the way men sometimes did, measuring angles and surfaces. He was reading something in her face, in the way she held herself. She met his gaze and didn't look away. "You are James Okoye's daughter," he said. "Yes." "He owes a significant amount of money." $3.2 million, she said. "I know." Something moved in his expression, almost respect, almost. "He sent his daughter to negotiate." "He didn't send me. He doesn't know I'm here." She kept her voice level. "I came to understand my options." "Your options are limited," he said. "Not unkindly, just factually. The debt is real. The men your father borrowed from operate within a larger structure. That structure has expectations." "What kind of expectations?" He was quiet for a moment. He had very still hands, she noticed, folded together on the table in front of him, completely without nervous movement. Everything about him suggested a man who had trained himself to take up exactly the space he intended and no more. "There is a proposal," he said. "It is unconventional." "Tell me." "The debt is cleared entirely. Your father's house is safe. His remaining assets are returned to him. The men he borrowed from consider the account closed." He paused. "In exchange, you would enter into a legal marriage. With me." The room was very quiet. Amara heard the air conditioning. She heard the faint sound of traffic 31 floors below. She heard her own heartbeat, which had not accelerated the way she would have expected, which was strange. Her body seemed to have gone into some mode beyond panic, past the territory where normal physical responses operated. "You're him," she said. "You're not an associate. You're Kang Ji-hoon." He didn't confirm or deny it. He didn't need to. "Why?" she said. Not asked. Just the word, flat, demanding an answer. "That's not a simple question." "Try." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the windows, Chicago spread gray and wide under a February sky, the color of old pewter. "My position requires a certain stability. A wife. The appearance of a settled life. Arrangements of this kind are not unusual in my world." "Arrangements," she said. "That's what you're calling this?" "What would you call it?" "I don't know yet." She looked at her hands on the table, her burgundy nails, her mother's ring on her right hand, the small gold band she had worn since the funeral. "What exactly would this arrangement require of me?" He told her clearly and without evasion. She would relocate to Seoul, live in his residence, appear with him at necessary social functions, maintain the legal marriage for a minimum of 2 years. He would provide her with every comfort, complete freedom within the residence, her own space, her own accounts, a monthly allowance. He would arrange her father's debt settlement before she set foot on the plane. "And you will never touch me," she said, "not unless you wish it." "I won't wish it." He held her gaze. "Then I won't touch you." She asked him 2 more questions. Whether her father would be protected from any other parties. Yes. Whether she could leave Seoul if there was a family emergency. Yes, with reasonable arrangement. She did not ask him anything personal. She did not ask about his organization or what he actually did or the specifics of how her father had ended up connected to his money. She already knew enough. Knowing more would make the decision harder, not easier. She told him she needed 24 hours. He said that was acceptable. She left the hotel and walked for 40 minutes through the cold without going anywhere, just walking, hands in her coat pockets, breath clouding in the February air. She walked past storefronts and corner churches and a schoolyard where even in the cold a few kids were running at recess, their voices carrying across the chain link. She stopped across the street and watched them for a moment, their coats bright against the gray asphalt, the complete uncomplicated physicality of children who didn't know yet how complicated things got. She taught first grade, 22 kids this year, ages 5 and 6, learning to read and add and exist in community with other humans. She had wanted to teach since she was 9 years old. She was good at it. She had turned down 3 higher-paying opportunities in other fields since getting her degree because she believed, specifically and concretely, that what she was doing mattered. That was not an abstraction. That was the organizing principle of her life. And her father had dismantled it in 2 years of sitting alone in front of a screen, clicking buttons and watching money vanish. She loved him. That was not in question. She loved him the way you loved the imperfect thing that made you, the complicated source of yourself, the man who had come to every school play and every graduation and wept openly at her mother's funeral and worked 32 years in a city bus so she could have things he hadn't had. She loved him, and she was furious at him. And both of those things were equally true, and neither of them made the decision easier. She went back to her apartment. She sat at her kitchen table for 4 hours. She made a list of every reason not to do it, which was a long list with compelling items. Then she made a list of what happened if she didn't, which was shorter but heavier. At midnight, she called her father. "I'm going to handle it," she said. "Amara, don't ask me how. Don't ask me anything. I'm going to handle it, and you are going to go to every session of Gamblers Anonymous for the rest of your natural life, and you are never going to do this again." Silence. Then, broken and low, "I'm sorry, baby." "I know you are." She closed her eyes. "I love you, Daddy. Go to sleep." She was on a plane to Seoul 11 days later. The debt settlement paperwork had been executed within 48 hours of her saying yes, efficient and thorough, every number precise, a legal document she had read 3 times, and had a lawyer friend review who confirmed it was real and binding and in her father's favor. Ji-hoon had not called her or contacted her during those 11 days. He had not tried to check on her decision or renegotiate the terms. He had simply waited, and she had found that, almost against her will, she'd noted the restraint. The flight was 14 hours. She slept for 3 of them, thin and unmemorable sleep that left her feeling worse. She ate the meal that came and drank water and watched the map on the screen in front of her showing the little plane icon crossing the Pacific, and she worked on not thinking too far ahead, on treating each hour as a separate thing that required only her presence and nothing more. Seoul in February was cold, a different cold than Chicago, drier and bright, the sky a sharp blue over a city that was enormous and vertical and moving fast. A car met her at the airport, black and silent, driven by a man who didn't speak to her but handled her bags with careful efficiency. She sat in the back and watched the city come up around her, the Han River visible in the distance, the apartment towers stacked close and tall, the evidence of a city of 10 million people who had nothing to do with her or her problems. The building was in Hanam, close to the river, glass and steel and understated luxury of the kind that didn't need to announce itself. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse. She stepped out and stood in the entrance and let herself take it in because it was extraordinary. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides. The river below, the city beyond, light coming in at an angle that caught the hardwood floors and the sparse, clean furniture. It was not the opulent excess she had half expected. It was the home of someone who had taste rather than need. Ji-hoon was standing near the windows when she came in. He was dressed more casually than the hotel. Dark trousers, a dark sweater, no jacket. He looked like a man at home, which was strange to register, that he had a home this was. He turned when she came in. He didn't smile, but he didn't look cold either. He looked like a man who had worked hard to be unreadable and had mostly succeeded. "You came," he said. "I said I would." He showed her the apartment. Her room was at the east end, separated from his by a sitting room and a stretch of hallway that made the distance clear. The room was larger than her entire Chicago apartment, with a view of the river, a bathroom with a soaking tub, and a small writing desk near the window. There were fresh flowers on the nightstand, white, simple, not extravagant. She didn't acknowledge them, and he didn't explain them. There were keys on the dresser, an envelope with a bank card and a handwritten note giving the PIN, and a local phone already configured. "The house staff comes Monday and Thursday," he said. "I'll introduce you when they come. You're not expected to manage them or interact with them in any way you don't choose." "Okay," she said. "I work irregular hours. Some nights I won't be here at all. You won't be disturbed." "And what am I supposed to do?" she asked. She hadn't meant it to come out sharp. It came out sharp anyway. He looked at her steadily. "Whatever you want. There are no requirements beyond the social appearances we discussed. Those I'll schedule with advance notice. Everything else is your own time." "I'm a teacher," she said. "I don't know how to have unstructured time." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one, a fractional softening around the eyes. Then structure it, he said. The city is available to you. He left her alone after that. She heard him move through the apartment, heard a door close, heard nothing more. She stood at the window of her room and looked at the Han River turning silver in the late afternoon light, the bridges spanning it at intervals, the mountains visible in the distance beyond the south side of the city. She had made the most consequential decision of her life in a kitchen at 4 in the morning and a lawyer's office 2 days later, and now she was standing in a stranger's home 6,000 miles from everything she knew, and the only honest assessment she could make was that she had absolutely no idea what happened next. She unpacked her suitcase. She arranged her books on the empty shelf because she had brought 7 books, and she needed to do something with her hands. She put her mother's photograph on the writing desk, the one from her parents' wedding in 1987, her mother laughing at something outside the frame. Her father caught mid-word, both of them 30 years younger than grief. She looked at the photograph for a moment and then looked away. She took a shower. She made a list. She put herself to bed at 9 o'clock Seoul time and lay in the dark with the river light moving on the ceiling and tried very hard to feel nothing in particular. She almost managed it. For 3 weeks, she and Ji-hoon lived in the same penthouse, like 2 people sharing a library, aware of each other, occupying the same space, doing nothing to close the distance. He was home in the evenings, perhaps 4 nights out of 7, and often left before she was awake. When they were both present, they sometimes ate dinner at the same table and sometimes didn't. Conversation was sparse and functional. She asked where the nearest subway station was. He told her. She asked if there was a gym in the building. There was. She found the English language bookstore in Itaewon on her 3rd day, and went every week after that. She learned the city. Not sentimentally, not as a tourist. She had not come here to be charmed. But practically, the way she learned any environment that was going to be her context for a significant amount of time. She learned the subway lines and the neighborhood markets, and which direction to walk when she needed to think. She began picking up Korean phrases not because anyone asked her to, but because she found not understanding what was around her more uncomfortable than the effort of learning. Ji-hoon's housekeeper, a stout woman in her 60s named Mrs. Park, discovered this and appointed herself a highly opinionated informal teacher who had no patience for mistakes and seemed to find Amara's determination both baffling and satisfying. Ji-hoon noticed. She knew he noticed because one evening she came back from the market having conducted an entire transaction in Korean, badly, haltingly, but entirely. And she was telling Mrs. Park about it when she turned and saw him standing in the kitchen doorway, listening with that expression she had begun to identify as the closest he got to openly pleased. "How many weeks have you been studying?" he asked. 3.5. "Your pronunciation is wrong," he said, but said it without edge. "The tones are off." "I know. I'm working on it." He pushed off the doorframe and came to the kitchen counter and poured himself water. "There's a class at the Sejong Center. Foreigners who want to learn Korean. You'd be ahead of most of them in vocabulary." She looked at him. "Are you recommending I take a class?" "I'm telling you the class exists." She went the following Tuesday. She was ahead of most of them. It was a small thing. But she cataloged it anyway because she was cataloging everything. The class recommendation, the way he moved the newspaper off the kitchen chair when she came in for coffee. The evening she came back from Itaewon in a downpour and found a towel and a dry pair of socks waiting outside her door with no explanation. Small adjustments. The behavior of a man who is paying attention without making a performance of it. She was careful not to read too much into it. She was careful not to read anything into it. She was not always successful. The social appearances began in the 5th week. An industry dinner, legitimate business, shipping, and logistics. The surface of what she understood to be a vast iceberg. She wore a deep green dress she had bought in Itaewon and stood beside Ji-hoon in a room full of Korean businessmen and their wives and spoke when spoken to and smiled with the precision of a woman who had years of experience smiling past discomfort. Ji-hoon introduced her simply as his wife. He did not explain. No one asked. She realized partway through the evening that his hand had settled at the small of her back. Not possessive, not performance, just a light present pressure that she had not consented to and also had not moved away from. In the car afterwards, she stared out the window and he stared out his window, and neither of them mentioned it. "You were good," he said finally, low, quiet. "In there. You were good." She kept her eyes on the passing city. "I've been performing fine for a long time." The silence that followed didn't feel empty. That night she lay awake for an hour longer than usual, listening to the apartment settle in the dark, and she thought about the weight of a hand she had not asked for and had not moved away from. And she told herself firmly and clearly that she was a woman who had made a rational transaction, and she was going to behave like one. She almost believed herself. But it was the Tuesday 6 weeks in that cracked the careful architecture she had been constructing. She came home early from her Korean class to find Ji-hoon in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly uncharacteristic in its disorder, bent over the stove with the focused concentration of a man engaged in something that required his full attention. He didn't hear her come in. The kitchen smelled of something rich and familiar. Not quite like anything she could name, but warm. He was talking quietly to himself, she realized, or to the pot, muttering in Korean the way her students sometimes muttered while working through a math problem. She watched him for probably 30 seconds before she said anything, long enough to feel embarrassed about watching. "What are you making?" she said. He startled, a slight jerk of the shoulder, which was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him. He turned. He looked at her, then at the stove, then at her again, and she saw something rare in his face, the faint flush of a man caught doing something private. "Doenjang jjigae," he said. "It was my grandmother's recipe." She set her bag down, came to the counter. The stove held a dark, aromatic broth with cubes of tofu and zucchini and what she identified as mushrooms. It looked and smelled nothing like the restaurant food she had been eating and entirely like a meal someone's grandmother had actually made. "You cook," she said. "Occasionally." "Why tonight?" He seemed to consider whether to answer. Then, "I cook when I need to not think about something else." She nodded slowly. She understood that. She graded papers for the same reason. The mechanical precision of it, the way it required just enough attention to crowd out everything else. "Can I have some?" she asked. He looked surprised, genuinely this time, not performatively. "Yes," he said. They ate at the kitchen counter, not the formal dining table. She sat on a stool and he stood, and the broth was exactly what the smell had promised, warm and deep and entirely real. And she ate 2 bowls, and he watched her do it with the expression of a man who was trying not to show that this pleased him and not fully succeeding. She asked him about his grandmother. He answered carefully at first, then less carefully. His grandmother had raised him from age 11, after his parents' accident. She had been a farmer's daughter from South Chungcheong province, a small woman who could silence a room with a look, who believed that food was the primary language of care and who had made this exact stew every Sunday of her life until she was unable to. Amara told him about her mother. Not much, just the rocking chair and the Sunday dinners and the way she used to sing while cleaning the kitchen. Old songs, Motown and gospel, singing without self-consciousness because the kitchen was her private room and she was queen of it. Ji-hoon listened. He didn't fill the pauses with noise. She found she appreciated that more than she expected to. She washed the bowls when they were done. He stood beside her and dried them, and they worked together in the narrow space of the kitchen, and when she turned to hand him the second bowl, their hands brushed and neither of them moved away immediately. And the silence in the kitchen was a different kind of silence than anything that had come before. She stepped back. She hung the dish towel on the rack. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. She went down the hallway to her room and closed the door and stood with her back against it in the dark and felt, for the first time since arriving in Seoul, genuinely frightened. Not of him, of herself. Of the specific and inconvenient discovery that the man she had sold herself to was not a monster, was not cold, was not simply an arrangement, but was a person. With a grandmother's recipes and a stove he cooked at when he couldn't sleep, and hands that dried dishes in a kitchen like he knew how. That was far more dangerous than anything she had prepared for. And then, 10 days later, she found the gun. She was not snooping. She wanted to be clear to herself about that. Not that it changed anything, but accuracy mattered. She had come into the main study to use the printer, which Ji-hoon had told her she was free to use, and she had pulled the wrong drawer in looking for paper and found it. Black, compact, resting on a cloth that suggested it was regularly cleaned and handled. There was a phone, too, in the drawer. A second phone, different from the one he used around her, prepaid by the look of it. and a photograph, a printed photograph, of a man she didn't recognize with a red mark through his face. She stood there for approximately 4 seconds. Then she closed the drawer. She got the paper from the correct drawer, printed what she needed to print, and went back to her room. She sat at her writing desk and looked at her mother's photograph and the river out the window and let herself feel for the first time with clear eyes the full weight of what she already knew and had been choosing not to examine too directly. Jihoon was not a businessman who occasionally made powerful enemies. He was not a morally complicated man who had drifted into gray territory. He was a crime lord, a Korean syndicate boss. The money her father had borrowed was criminal money, and the apartment she lived in and the food she ate and the security she moved through the city under, all of it was built on something she could not see cleanly and might not want to. She had known this. She had chosen not to dwell on it because dwelling didn't help anything, and the transaction was already made. But the drawer had forced the clarity she had been avoiding. She was married to this man. She was developing feelings for this man. And she had absolutely no safe direction to look. The first major public event came 3 weeks later. A charity gala at a venue overlooking the Han River. All glass and candlelight, and a guest list that included 4 politicians, 2 corporate executives she recognized from international news, and a dense network of people who knew each other in ways that had nothing to do with what their business cards said. Jihoon in a black suit was a different proposition from Jihoon in a kitchen, she noted privately. Harder, more precisely assembled. The warmth she had begun to map carefully retracted behind something smooth and controlled. But when the dancing started and he turned and offered her his hand, there was nothing controlled in the way he looked at her. She took his hand. She had danced with men before. She had not been held like this before, carefully, as though she was something that could be broken. Which was funny, given that she was the least breakable person she knew. Or maybe it wasn't funny at all. Maybe it was the most accurate reading of her anyone had offered. They moved together beneath lights that swam and shifted, and he bent slightly toward her because he was taller, and she felt his breath near her temple and felt the warmth of his hand on her back and told herself sternly that this was performance, this was the arrangement, this was what they were here for. Then he spoke. "You matter more to me than this contract," he said. Low, near her ear, too quiet for anyone else. "I want you to know that. Whatever happens, I want you to have known that." She kept moving with the music. She did not answer. Her throat had done something unhelpful. Later she would think about that moment as the last one before everything changed. Not because of what he said, but because of what she felt when he said it, which was not suspicion or wariness or the careful calculation she had trained herself to apply. What she felt was the terrifying, specific, unwanted certainty that she believed him. That was where part 1 ends. Not at the gala, not with a confession or a kiss, but with Amara Okoye standing in a room full of strangers in a city that was not hers, in the arms of a man she had sold her future to, feeling for the first time in her adult life completely without armor. The question she had not answered yet was whether that was the beginning of something real or the beginning of something she would spend years trying to survive. She wouldn't know the answer for a long time, but by then it would be too late to not care. She didn't sleep that night. Not because of the gala, exactly. Not because of what he had said on the dance floor, though those words had embedded themselves somewhere below rational reach and refused to dislodge. She didn't sleep because she lay in the dark of her room and listened to the apartment and heard him, still awake, moving through the kitchen at 2 a.m, the low sound of a drawer opening and closing, water running, the particular silence of a man sitting down heavily under a weight she couldn't name. She lay on her back with her eyes open and told herself not to move. She moved at 2:47. She found him at the kitchen table with a glass of water and a folder of documents spread in front of him that he closed when he heard her come in. Not quickly, not the way a guilty man moved, but deliberately. The way a man moved when he didn't want to share the contents, which was different. He looked at her without surprise, as though he had half expected her. "Can't sleep," she said. Not a question. "No." She went to the refrigerator and stood in its light for a moment without wanting anything, and then poured herself water because she was already standing there. She leaned against the counter. The kitchen clock said 2:49. Outside, Seoul was fully dark and fully awake the way big cities always were, a low ambient roar that never entirely went away. "What you said," she started. "You don't have to respond to it." "I know I don't." She looked at her glass. "I'm not responding to it. I'm telling you it's not something I know what to do with." He considered that. His hands were flat on the closed folder. He had taken off his jacket and tie hours ago and sat in his shirt sleeves, and he looked tired in a way she hadn't seen before, but not physically tired, but the other kind, the kind that came from carrying something for a long time without being able to put it down. "Neither do I," he said. That was not what she had expected. She had expected something measured and composed, the careful Ji-hoon who managed everything with a surface she couldn't get purchase on. Not this. Not the admission that he was in the same uncharted territory she was. "Then why say it?" she asked. "Because it was true. I don't say things that aren't." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. The kitchen light was low and yellow, and the city hummed outside, and between them was a silence that had weight and temperature that pressed against her chest. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. She went back to her room. She did not sleep for another hour. When she finally did, she dreamed about the drawer, the gun on its cloth, the photograph with the red mark, the second phone. She dreamed about it clearly and woke with it still present and got up and made coffee and stood at the river window and watched the light come up over the Han and tried to arrange her feelings into something she could manage. She couldn't. The weeks that followed moved in a rhythm that she hadn't anticipated. Not the brittle, careful coexistence of the first month, but something less defended. They ate breakfast together 4 mornings out of 7 when their schedules allowed. He taught her to make doenjang jigai, standing beside her at the stove and correcting her proportions with the same direct precision he seemed to apply to everything, and she pretended to be more impatient with his corrections than she actually was. She told him about her students, the one this year who had arrived in September unable to hold a pencil correctly and by December could write his own full name. And he listened the way she had learned he listened to everything, completely, without performing interest, just actually present. It was, she thought, the thing about him that undid her most reliably. Not his face, or his stillness, or the particular way he occupied a room, the way he listened as though what she said was the most relevant thing currently happening. Mrs. Park watched all of this with the frank assessment of a woman who had been in the household long enough to have opinions and no particular inclination to hide them. One Thursday morning, she arrived to find Amara and Ji-hoon both in the kitchen, Amara drilling Korean vocabulary from flashcards she had made herself, Ji-hoon reading contracts, and occasionally correcting her pronunciation without looking up. And Mrs. Park set down her cleaning supplies and looked at them with an expression of profound satisfaction that she made absolutely no effort to conceal. "Better," Mrs. Park said, to no one specifically. Ji-hoon said something rapid in Korean. Mrs. Park said something back. It had the cadence of an argument they had conducted before, affectionate and declarative. Amara looked between them. "What did she say?" she asked. "Nothing," Ji-hoon said. "He says nothing," Mrs. Park said in careful English. "But his face says everything." Ji-hoon put down his contract. "Mrs. Park, I am cleaning," Mrs. Park said serenely, and went to clean something. Amara looked at Ji-hoon. His jaw was set. There was color at the back of his neck, very faint. She looked down at her flashcards before he could see that she was smiling. It was the closest thing to happiness she had felt since arriving. She was aware this was a problem. The problem had a name, and the name arrived 6 weeks after the gala in the form of a phone call that Ji-hoon took in his study with the door closed. She was not near the door. She was in the sitting room with a book she had stopped reading, and she heard his voice shift, the particular shift she had learned to register, where the surface that was always somewhat controlled went, an additional register lower and tighter, the voice he used when the call was not about legitimate business. He was on the phone for 40 minutes. When he came out, he did not explain, and she did not ask. But that evening, a man came to the apartment. Ji-hoon introduced him as Seo Dae-won, a senior associate. He was 40 or so, broader than Ji-hoon, with a careful smile that sat on his face like a piece of furniture that didn't quite fit the room. He looked at Amara with the specific appraisal of a man calculating her relevance, weighing how much she knew and how much that knowledge mattered. "The American wife," he said in English, pleasantly. "The Korean associate," she said back, equally pleasantly. Something moved in Dae-won's eyes. Amusement, maybe. Or reassessment. He turned back to Ji-hoon and they spoke in Korean. And she excused herself not because she was asked to, but because she recognized when her presence was technically tolerated rather than actually welcome. She went to her room and sat at her desk, and noticed that her hands were slightly cold. Later, when day one was gone, she went to the kitchen and found Ji-hoon standing at the counter with his back to her, perfectly still, the way he went still when something was costing him significant effort to contain. "Problem?" she said. He turned. His face was composed. "Nothing that concerns you. I live here." "I know where you live." She folded her arms. "That man doesn't like me." "It doesn't matter whether he likes you. It matters to me." "Why?" She looked at him. "Because I've been here 4 months, and I've been careful, and I've been appropriate, and I've been whatever this arrangement requires me to be. And that man walked in here and looked at me like I was an inconvenience that might need to be managed. And you didn't say a word." Ji-hoon's jaw worked once. He set down the glass he'd been holding. "Day one handles certain operations on my behalf. He has concerns about exposure, about the arrangement being a liability. He thinks I'm a liability. He thinks relationships are liabilities in general." "And what do you think?" she asked. The kitchen was quiet. He looked at her steadily, and in his eyes was something she couldn't fully read. Not the careful blankness she had first encountered, but the actual complicated thing beneath it. "I think," he said slowly, "that I've made decisions I can't unmake, and some of them I don't want to." She held his gaze. "That's not an answer." "It's the only honest one I have right now." She stood there for another moment. Then she nodded once, short and tight, and went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about the word exposure, and the way Daewon's eyes had calculated her, and the fact that Ji-hoon had not told him to stop. And she felt for the first time since the gala the fine cold edge of something she recognized as fear. Not of Ji-hoon, of the world he inhabited, of the ways that world did not care about arrangements or contracts or a woman's careful management of her own feelings. Of the fact that she was in it now, all the way in, and the door behind her had been closing so gradually she hadn't noticed until it was already shut. She called her father the next morning. He sounded better than he had. His voice had some of its old steadiness back, and he told her about his GA meetings with a directness that she recognized as genuine commitment, not performance. She asked about the house, about his health. He asked about Seoul, and she told him about the food, and the language class, and the subway, and left out everything else, which was most of it. "You sound different," he said. "Different how?" "I don't know. Settled. You sound like you've settled somewhere." She watched the river. "It's a complicated place." "Complicated good or complicated bad?" She was quiet for a moment. "Both." He didn't push. He never had, which was part of why she loved him, and part of why he had been able to hide his problem for 6 months. She told him she'd call Sunday and hung up and sat with the phone in her hands and thought about the word settled and whether it was an accurate word for what was happening. It wasn't. Settled implied resolution. What she was something else. Embedded, maybe. Tangled. The architecture of her careful separateness had developed foundations neither of them had planned. That afternoon, she went to the bookstore in Itaewon and spent 2 hours with her back against a shelf in the English section reading the first 100 pages of a novel she'd been meaning to read for a year. And nobody needed anything from her, and she needed nothing from anyone. And it was, for a small window of time, entirely peaceful. She was on the subway home when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. "You don't know what your husband is? Ask him about Busan. Ask him about what happened 3 years ago. You should know what you're sleeping next to." She read it twice. The subway car rocked and lurched under her. The other passengers sat with their own phones and their own thoughts and paid her no attention. She deleted the message. She did not ask Ji-hoon about Busan that evening. She ate dinner and talked about her book and watched his face and stored it away. The message, the number, the word Busan, and said nothing. She was not naive. She had known from the beginning what he was. The message told her nothing she didn't already know in outline. But the specific word, Busan, 3 years ago, had a particular weight. Specificity was different from abstraction. Specificity meant an event, a named thing. She spent 4 days not asking. On the 5th day, she asked. She waited until evening, until Mrs. Park was gone and the apartment was quiet. He was in the sitting room with a book that she suspected he wasn't reading, and she came in and sat in the chair across from him and said, "What happened in Busan 3 years ago?" He went very still. Not the composed stillness. The other kind. The stillness of a man processing where a thing came from and what it meant that it had arrived. "Who told you about Busan?" he said. "An anonymous message. 2 weeks ago. I deleted it." 2 weeks. His voice had gone flat. "You've been sitting on this for 2 weeks. I needed to think about whether to ask." He set the book down. He looked at the floor for a moment, then at her, and the careful surface was gone. Not replaced by anger or defensiveness, but by something raw, something that had the quality of a man deciding how much truth he was capable of giving. "There was a man," he said, "a trafficker. He operated out of Busan, moved through a shipping network I had partial interest in at the time." He paused. "I found out what he was doing with that network. I removed him from it." Silence. "You killed him," she said. "Yes." "And the people he worked with?" "Addressed," she breathed. The room had the particular weight of a space where something important was happening in very few words. "The photograph in your desk drawer," she said. "The one with the mark on it." His eyes sharpened. "You saw that?" "I was looking for printer paper. I wasn't—" She stopped. "Is it the same kind of thing?" He was quiet for a long moment. "It's related," he said carefully. "Ji-hoon," she leaned forward, "I'm not going to fall apart. I'm not going to run to the police. I'm not your enemy. But I need you to tell me what I'm actually living inside of, because I have been managing on partial information and I can't—" Her voice caught on something. She pressed through it. "I can't keep doing that." He looked at her for a long time. She could see him calculating. Not whether to trust her, she thought, but how much truth was survivable, how much she could actually hold. "The man in the photograph," he said slowly, "is named Cha Min-seok. He was my second in command for 6 years. He has recently begun developing independent ambitions that create problems. For you. For everyone in my organization, including anyone associated with me." The word anyone landed with the weight he intended. She felt it. "Am I in danger?" she asked, direct and flat. "Not immediately," he said. "I'm managing it." "Managing it," she repeated. "Yes." "The way you managed Busan." He held her gaze. "If necessary." She sat back. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, at the clean white plaster and the low light of the lamp, at the entirely ordinary surface of a room in which a man had just calmly told her he would kill someone if required. She thought about the text message, about whoever had sent it and why, about Daewon's calculating smile and the folder Ji-hoon had closed at the kitchen table at 3 a.m. She thought about the doenjang jjigae and the flashcards and his hand at the small of her back on the dance floor. "When this is resolved," she said, "the Min-seok situation, what happens after that?" He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, complicated and careful and carrying something behind it she couldn't fully name. "That depends," he said, "on what you want after." She didn't answer that. She wasn't ready to answer that. She stood, and she looked down at him, and she said, "Don't lie to me. Whatever else this is, don't lie to me. That's the one thing I actually need." "I haven't," he said. "I won't." She nodded. She went to her room. She lay down on top of the covers without undressing and stared at the ceiling and felt the full, complicated mass of the situation pressing on her chest. The danger that was apparently real and ongoing, the man who had just told her he killed a trafficker and would kill again if he had to, and the fact that neither of these things had managed to dislodge the thing she was trying not to feel for him, which was the most damning information she had encountered in months. She was not falling in love with a fiction. She was falling in love with a man who had a gun in his desk drawer, and a photograph with a red mark, and a former underboss who was developing ambitions, and she was doing it clear-eyed and fully informed, and without the comfort of being able to tell herself she hadn't known what he was. That was worse. That was so much worse than not knowing. 2 nights later, she stopped fighting it. It was not dramatic. There was no moment of declaration or overwhelm. She came home from her Korean class in the late evening to find him in the kitchen making tea. Ordinary domestic act, shirt sleeves, steam rising. And he looked up when she came in, And something in the way he looked at her was so entirely unguarded that she crossed the kitchen and he set down the kettle. And when she kissed him, he kissed her back with the contained desperation of a man who had been waiting for something for a long time and had given up expecting it to arrive. They stood in the kitchen for a long time. Outside the windows, Sol blazed and moved and didn't care. And inside the apartment, something irrevocable had just quietly occurred. 5 months after that first kiss, on a Tuesday morning in October with rain streaking the river windows and Ji-hoon in the shower and Mrs. Park not yet arrived, Amara Okoye sat on the edge of the bathroom counter in the small ensuite of their bedroom and looked at the 2 lines on the test she had been putting off taking for 11 days and felt the world reorganize itself entirely around a single fact. Twins, the ultrasound would confirm 3 weeks later. 2 heartbeats. 2 small, complete things coming whether she had planned for them or not. She looked at the test for a long time. She heard the shower cut off. She heard him moving in the bathroom, the sound of a cabinet opening. She sat very still on the counter and held the test in both hands and thought about the drawer with the gun and the photograph with the red mark and Cha Min-seok developing his ambitions and 2 heartbeats that had no idea what world they were arriving in. Ji-hoon opened the bathroom door. He stopped. He looked at her face first, the way he always read her, starting with her face, and then at her hands and what was in them. She watched the information move through him, the stillness, the almost imperceptible intake of breath, the precise moment when it landed and his face did something entirely outside his control. "Amara," he said, low and unsteady. "2," she said. "The test says—" Her voice broke on a small, unexpected thing. She pressed through it. "There are 2. He crossed the bathroom in 2 steps. He didn't take the test from her hands. He actually knelt, on the tile floor of their bathroom, and put both hands over hers and looked up at her face with an expression she had never seen on him before, something stripped of every layer of management and protection. "We'll be all right," he said. "All of us." She looked at him kneeling on the tile in the morning light, hands over hers, and she believed him with a completeness that should have been comforting. It wasn't. Because 3 weeks later, on the same night she got the ultrasound confirmation, 2 heartbeats strong and clear on the screen, she came home early from the clinic to find the door to Ji-hoon's private office standing slightly open. She hadn't meant to look. She had been walking past, mindful of heartbeats and names, and the overwhelming logistics of 2 lives she was now responsible for. She looked. The man in the office was one she didn't recognize, heavy, middle-aged, on his knees with his hands raised. Ji-hoon was standing. He was speaking in Korean, low and unhurried, with the specific stillness she now knew was the stillness of a man who had made a decision and was at complete peace with it. Then he raised the gun. She did not scream. Some deep, cold part of her brain registered the scene and immediately locked everything down. Sound, movement, reaction. She stood in the hallway and watched through the 3-inch gap of the open door, and what she saw took approximately 4 seconds, and then it was over, and the only sound was the particular quality of silence that followed something that could not be undone. She backed away from the door. She went to the bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed. She put both hands flat on her knees and felt her body doing all the things bodies did. Shaking, cold, breath wrong. And behind her eyes, playing on a loop, was the expression on Ji-hoon's face as he had raised the weapon. Not rage. Not satisfaction. Nothing. That was the thing that would not leave her. The complete, practiced absence of anything. Not the act itself. She had known. She had known what he was. She had no claim to shock at the existence of violence in his world. But the nothing. The man she had watched cook his grandmother's recipe with focused, gentle hands was the same man whose face had held nothing at all in that moment. And the distance between those 2 things was so vast, she couldn't find the bridge. She sat on the bed for a long time. She thought about 2 heartbeats. She thought about Busan and Min-seok and the folder at 3 in the morning and all the things she had chosen to hold alongside rather than run from. And she thought about her sons. Her sons. That was real. That was happening. Growing up inside the radius of what she had just seen. She thought about the nothing on his face. She did not sleep that night. In the early hours of the morning, while Ji-hoon slept beside her with his arm across her waist, she lay with her eyes open and made the decision she had been afraid of making since October. She made it quietly and completely. And once it was made, she did not unmake it. She waited 3 more days because she needed to be certain. She was certain. On the 4th day, while Ji-hoon was at a morning meeting, she packed one bag. She wrote a letter. She did not try to explain everything, right? There was no language for everything. But she wrote enough. That she loved him. That she believed the man he showed her was real. That she had seen his face in the office and understood that the other man was also real, and she could not raise her sons in a house where both men lived. She put the letter on the kitchen counter beside his coffee cup, where he would find it first thing. She took her coat and her bag and her mother's photograph from the writing desk. She did not look at the river. She walked out of the penthouse and did not come back. And the elevator doors closed behind her and Seoul swallowed her whole, and by the time Ji-hoon returned to an apartment that had her letter and none of her, Amara Okoye was already in the air, flying west, toward a city he had never been to, carrying 2 lives who did not yet know their father's name. Portland came up gray and wet in early March, the kind of city that seemed designed for people who needed to disappear. The rain, a constant low curtain, the neighborhoods folded into themselves, nobody asking questions because nobody particularly wanted to be asked questions either. Amara had chosen it for 3 reasons. She had a college friend there, a woman named Dana, who had moved west years ago and built a quiet life and would not ask too much. The cost of living was manageable on savings while she rebuilt. And it was as far from Seoul as she could get without leaving the country, which she could not do because her passport was in her own name, and she understood, in the cold practical part of her brain that had carried her through every hard thing, that distance was only useful if it was also invisible. She had the twins in June, 2 boys, healthy and furious about being born, 7 pounds each, arriving 4 minutes apart in a hospital where no one knew her married name. She had gone back to Okoye on all the paperwork. The birth certificate said father unknown. She held them in the delivery room, 1 in each arm, and felt something so enormous and terrifying and complete that she couldn't find language for it. Only the physical fact of them, their weight, their heat, the particular blind urgency of their need. And she looked at their faces and saw Ji-hoon in the set of their brows and felt grief and love so tangled together she couldn't separate the threads. She named them Marcus and James. Marcus for no one, just a name she loved. James for her father, who flew out 2 weeks after the birth and sat in her small apartment and held both boys and wept openly and did not ask any of the questions she could see pressing at him. He stayed 4 days. He went back to Chicago. He called every Sunday. 3 years passed. They were not easy years, but they were hers. She found work at a children's bookstore in the Pearl District, a narrow place full of good light and the particular smell of new books, run by a woman named Carol, who had 2 grown kids and a management style that amounted to leaving good employees alone to do their jobs. She was good at her job. She read to the kids who came in on Saturday mornings, the same way she had read to her first graders, with full commitment and without condescension. And the children sat in the circle on the reading rug and leaned toward her voice the way children lean toward warmth. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The twins went to a daycare 4 blocks from the apartment, run by a woman named Gloria, who had the unshakable calm of someone who had managed toddlers for 30 years and could not be rattled by anything. Marcus and James were loud and physical, and opinionated and deeply attached to each other in the way of children who had shared space since before they had language. They were, at 3, the most complete argument she had ever encountered for the position that the world contained things worth protecting at any cost. She thought about Ji-hoon every day. She was not going to lie to herself about that. She thought about him with the steady, controlled ache of someone managing a chronic condition, present, always present, but workable if she kept moving. She thought about his hands over hers on the bathroom tile. She thought about his face at the gala. She thought about the nothing in his eyes in the doorway of the office, and she held that image carefully. Like a splinter she kept in place to remind herself why she had left. She did not contact him. She did not look for information about him. She built her life in Portland with the focused, forward-only energy of a woman who understood that looking back was the one indulgence she could not afford. She almost made it. What? The photograph started in September, 3 years and 3 months after she had walked out of the Seoul penthouse. The first one was on her windshield when she came out of the bookstore on a Tuesday evening. A plain white envelope, no writing on the outside, tucked under the wiper blade. Inside was a photograph. Marcus and James at the daycare playground, shot from a distance but clearly focused, their faces identifiable. Taken that day, judging by what they were wearing. She stood on the sidewalk in the rain and looked at it for a long time. Her hands were steady. Her hands were the last thing to go with her, always. They had been steady in the hotel room when she made the deal, and steady in the hospital when she was in labor, and they were steady now, holding the photograph, while the rest of her performed the calm calculation of a woman who had known this was possible and had hoped it was not. She went straight to Dana's apartment instead of her own. She sat at Dana's kitchen table, and Dana looked at the photograph and went very quiet, in the particular way of someone who understood the weight of something without needing it explained. "How long have you been watching for this?" Dana asked. "Since the beginning," Amar said. "I've been watching since the beginning." "What do you do now?" She didn't answer that night. She took the boys home, put them to bed, checked the locks. New habit, updated locks 2 weeks after arriving in Portland, something she had done without overthinking and had been grateful for every day since. She sat at her kitchen table after they were asleep and looked at the photograph and thought through everything she knew, which was not nothing. She knew Ji-hoon had resources that made conventional hiding essentially theoretical. She had known this leaving Seoul. She had made it 3 years not because he couldn't find her, but because, she had told herself, he hadn't been looking, or had been looking and had been waiting. She had not allowed herself to examine which was more likely, because the examination led to a conclusion she wasn't ready for. The second photograph was on her apartment doorstep 3 days later. The boys asleep in their room, shot through the window. Her bedroom window. The angle indicated someone had been at the level of the fire escape. She called a locksmith and had every lock in the apartment upgraded that afternoon. She moved the boys' beds to the interior wall. She put a simple alarm on the window. She did all of this without telling them anything because they were 3 years old, and the only thing protecting them right now was their complete unawareness of the situation. She was considering her next move, specifically whether to run again, whether Portland was already burned, whether she had enough in savings to relocate on a week's notice, when she walked into the bookstore on a Thursday morning and found him standing at the front counter, older, thinner, the angles of his face sharper than she remembered, the shadows under his eyes the kind that accumulated over years rather than nights. He was wearing a dark coat, damp from the rain, and he stood with his hands at his sides and looked at her with an expression she had no category for. Not anger, not demand, something that had passed entirely beyond those things into something quieter and more devastating. She stopped 6 feet from him. Carol was behind the counter pretending to look at something. The store was otherwise empty. "You should go," Amara said. Her voice came out level. She was surprised. "I know," he said. "Then go." "I will. I need to say something first." She did not move toward him. She did not move away. She stood on the wood floor of the bookstore with the smell of new books around her, and looked at the man she had loved and left, and looked at for 3 years in the face of their sons without ever once being able to stop, and she kept her face blank and her hands still. "Say it," she said. He reached into his coat and placed something on the counter between them, a photograph. Not like the ones on her windshield in her doorstep. A different photograph, older, printed on glossy paper. She didn't look at it yet. She kept her eyes on his face. "The man you saw in the office," he said, "in Seoul, the night you left." "I remember." His name was Park Hyun-tae. He ran the financial side of a trafficking network that had been operating through the shipping infrastructure for 11 months before I identified it. Children. He paused on that word, held it plainly without decoration. He was the payment processor, the man who made the operation solvent. Another pause. "I had him in custody for 6 hours before that evening. I gave him time to give me the people above him. He gave me 2 names. When he was finished, he was no longer useful, and he was too dangerous to release." Amara looked at the photograph on the counter. It was a document, a criminal investigation file page, Korean National Police, with names and photographs and the particular bureaucratic density of official records. Park Hyun-tae's name was at the top. The words below it were in Korean, but the photographs were not ambiguous. She looked at it for a long time. Her throat had done something complicated. She swallowed past it. "That doesn't change what I saw," she said. Her voice was quieter than she intended. "No," he said. "It doesn't. I know what you saw. I know what my face looked like." He was direct about this, without apology, but without dismissal either. I'm not asking you to have felt differently. I'm asking you to know the full truth of what it was. She looked at him. Why now? Why walk in here 3 years later and tell me this now? Because someone has been watching your apartment. His voice stayed even, but something underneath it had an edge. Not me. Not my people. Someone else. I've known where you were for 18 months. I haven't come because I believed you were safe, and I believed you had the right to make the choice you made. He stopped. The photographs on your car and your door, those aren't from my organization. The bookstore was very quiet. Who then? She said. Chamin Siok, he said. My former underboss. He found you 8 weeks ago. I don't know how. I found out 6 days ago. The cold that went through her was immediate and physical. Not fear exactly, but the body's recognition of threat, the animal intelligence that lived below thought. She had heard the name Min Seok before, from Ji-hoon in the sitting room the night she had asked about the photograph with the red mark. Former underboss. Independent ambitions. Problems. Why me? She said. Why come after me? Because he wants leverage, Ji-hoon said, and because he wants to hurt me. I left the organization 14 months ago. I began the exit 18 months ago, after your letter. I spent the time since selling operations, liquidating criminal assets, moving everything into legitimate structures. Hotels, shipping, restaurants. He said it without performance, as facts requiring acknowledgement rather than credit. Min Seok sees that as a betrayal. He believes if he has you and the boys, he has a way to force me back in or destroy me completely. The boys. He said it without hesitation, which meant he knew. Of course he knew. She had always understood on some level that he knew. They're mine, she said, sharp and immediate. Yes, he said. Just that. No qualification, no demand, no claim in the word. She looked at him standing in her bookstore in his rain-damp coat, 3 years older and thinner and carrying in his face the accumulated weight of everything that had happened. And she hated how much she still understood him. She hated that she could read him. She hated that seeing him had done nothing to reduce the specific complicated ache she had been managing for 3 years. That he was still the same problem she had left Seoul to escape. And the problem was standing 6 feet away in Portland, Oregon, looking at her like she was the only fixed point in his compass. What are you proposing? She said. I want to move you somewhere safe, he said. All 3 of you. Until Min Seok is dealt with. Dealt with, she said. The echo was deliberate. He held her gaze. Permanently. And then what? Then you're free. Whatever you want to do after that is your choice. I'm not here to reclaim anything. He looked at her steadily. I just need you to be alive to make that choice. She turned away from him. She went to the window and looked at the Portland street, the rain, the ordinary morning traffic, a woman walking a dog, a delivery driver hauling boxes. The normal, absolute surface of a life that had been fractured the moment she'd picked up a black card in her father's kitchen at 4 a.m. and chosen to dial. She stood there for 60 seconds. Then she turned back. You have 48 hours, she said. If you can't move us in 48 hours, I move myself. I can move you in 12, he said. She nodded once. There's one condition. Name it. The boys don't know anything yet. They're 3. They don't need to know anything yet. She held his eyes. Whatever this is, whatever happens next, they stay protected from it for as long as possible. Agreed, he said. She picked up the police photograph from the counter. She looked at it one more time. She put it in her coat pocket and went to the back of the bookstore and stood alone among the inventory shelves in the quiet and let herself feel, just for a moment, the full catastrophic weight of the fact that she had been wrong. Not about leaving. She had not been wrong to leave. She still believed that. She had made the only decision she could make with what she had. But about what she had seen. About what it meant. She had looked through a 3-inch gap in a door and made a judgment that had reorganized 3 years of her life. And the judgment had been correct in its facts and wrong in its meaning. And the gap between those two things was a specific kind of devastation that she was going to have to sit with for a very long time. She went back to the floor. Carol was still pretending to look at something. Ji-hoon was still standing where she had left him. Tonight, she said. Come back tonight at 8. I'll have the boys ready. He nodded. He left. She stood in the bookstore and watched his coat disappear into the Portland rain and pressed her thumbnail into her palm until the sharp, clean pressure was enough to keep her present. And then she went back to work because the boys needed to be picked up at 5, and the day was not finished. And she was not the kind of woman who stopped functioning simply because the world was on fire. She called Dana from the back room. "He found me," she said. Dana was quiet for a moment. "Ji-hoon?" "And someone else. Someone worse." She looked at the wall. "I'm going with him tonight. I need you to know, in case—" "Don't finish that sentence," Dana said, sharp and immediate. "In case," Amar repeated. "My father's number is in your phone. If you don't hear from me in 2 weeks, call him." A long pause. "Are you going to be okay?" She thought about the photograph on the counter and the document in her pocket and Min Seok's name and 2 boys who needed to be picked up at 5. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I'll tell you when I do." She hung up. She worked the rest of her shift with the steadiness she had trained into herself over years of needing it. She smiled at customers. She rang up purchases. She read 3 pages of a picture book to a 4-year-old who wandered in with her grandmother and sat on the reading rug with the absolute focused trust of a child who believed the world was safe and people could be counted on. Amara read every word clearly and without her voice breaking. At 5, she picked up the boys. Marcus had drawn a picture of a dog at daycare and was carrying it with the seriousness of a man transporting a document of significant importance. James had apparently bitten another child. Not hard, no skin broken, but Gloria's expression suggested this was a pattern requiring attention. Amara apologized and meant it, and took them both by the hand and walked the 4 blocks home through the rain with one small hand in each of hers, their rain boots hitting the puddles with the unguarded joy of children who didn't know yet that puddles would eventually become something to avoid. She fed them dinner. She bathed them. She read them 2 books each because Marcus insisted on 2, and James would not accept a different number than his brother. She put them in their pajamas and sat on the edge of Marcus's bed and looked at them in the low lamp light. Their faces, Ji-hoon's brows, her own mouth on both of them, small and complete and entirely unaware. And she made herself feel the full weight of what she was about to do, because she believed that clarity was a form of respect, that decisions deserved to be made with eyes open. She was choosing to trust a man she had left. She was choosing to take her sons into his protection. She was doing it because the alternative was running again, and running was no longer enough. Min Seok had found them here, and a man with that kind of reach would find them wherever she went next, and the only variable she could actually control was who was standing between her sons and that reach. Ji-hoon knocked at 8 o'clock. She opened the door. He stood in the hallway with 2 men behind him, calm, professional, the specific quality of trained security. He looked at her face and she looked at his, and neither of them wasted time. "They're asleep," she said. "We'll need to carry them." He nodded. He came inside without being invited, which she had expected, and stopped in the center of her living room and looked around at the small space she had built. The books, the twins' drawings taped to the refrigerator, her mother's photograph on the shelf above the television, with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something like grief. Something like the specific pain of a man confronting the evidence of time he hadn't been present for. She let him look. Then she said, "Marcus is on the left," and went to get her bag. They were in the car by 8:20, both boys asleep, and transferred with the boneless flexibility of deeply sleeping toddlers, buckled into the car seats Ji-hoon's people had somehow produced, which she decided not to think about too hard. The city moved past the windows. She sat in the back between her sons with one hand on each of them and looked at Ji-hoon in the front passenger seat, the back of his head, the set of his shoulders. She had so many things to say to him that she had no idea where to start. She started nowhere. She kept both hands on her sons and watched the city give way to the highway and the highway give way to dark, and she let herself sit inside the enormity of what had happened without trying to resolve it into something manageable. Somewhere outside Portland, Marcus stirred and opened his eyes and looked up at her with the unfocused trust of a child waking from deep sleep. "Mama," he said, not asking, just naming her, just confirming the fixed point. "Right here," she said. "Go back to sleep." He closed his eyes. Ji-hoon's shoulders moved slightly in the front seat, the smallest possible motion, barely perceptible. She saw it because she had spent months learning to read him. She looked out the window at the dark. Somewhere ahead, in a location she didn't know yet, was a safe house or an estate or whatever Ji-hoon had arranged, and inside it was the next chapter of something she had tried to end and had not been able to end, and she was going to walk into it with both eyes open and her son's hands in hers and whatever was left of the woman she had been building in Portland, and she was going to find out if the man in the front seat was still the same man who had knelt on a bathroom tile and said, "All of us." She was going to find out whether trust was something that could be rebuilt from the specific rubble they had made, or whether she was driving into a different kind of ending than either of them had planned. The highway ran straight and dark ahead of them. Neither of them said a word. And in the morning, when the boys woke in a strange room and looked to her to tell them whether to be afraid, she was going to need to have an answer ready. Because that was what she had always done, what she had always been, the fixed point that made the world make sense for the two people who needed it most. She was going to need to have decided, before morning, whether she still believed in the man driving toward whatever came next. The miles passed. She was still deciding when the car turned off the highway onto a mountain road she didn't recognize, climbing into the dark, and through the windshield she could see, far above, the faint lights of something large and fortified sitting high against the Korean countryside sky. Because they had not gone to a safe house in Oregon, she realized. They had gone to the airport. She had been so focused on her sons that she hadn't registered the route until now, until the mountain road, until the lights above, until the particular quality of the air coming through the vents that was not Oregon air at all. She was in Korea. He had brought her back to Korea. She looked at the back of his head and felt the cold rush of it. Not betrayal, not exactly, but the hard, specific understanding that she had gotten into this car and trusted the direction, and he had brought her to the one place she had spent 3 years trying to leave. And whether that was protection or control or both, she did not yet know. And the car was still climbing, and the lights above were getting closer, and her sons were asleep against her sides, and she didn't say anything right away. That was the thing about real fury. It didn't come out loud. Not at first. It came out as stillness, as the absolute compression of every reaction into a single controlled point, the way pressure built behind a wall before the wall gave. Amara sat in the back of the car with her son sleeping against her sides and looked at the back of Ji-hoon's head and felt the fury move through her like cold water, floor to ceiling, filling every available space. The car stopped at a gate, stone pillars, iron, a guardhouse with 2 men who exchanged words with the driver and waved them through. The road beyond was private and paved and lined with pine trees that stood black against the pre-dawn sky. The estate emerged from the dark gradually. Large, low Korean traditional architecture updated with steel and glass, set against the mountain with the particular permanence of something built to last through things. The car stopped. The driver cut the engine. Ji-hoon turned in his seat. She looked at him. "You should have told me," she said. Quiet. Entirely level. "Before I got in the car, you should have told me. If I had told you, you wouldn't have come. That was my choice to make. Min Seok has contacts in Portland, people watching exit routes. If I had stopped to negotiate with you about the destination, we would have lost the window." His voice was even but not defensive, factual, the way he presented things he had decided and stood behind. "I made a judgment call. You made a judgment call about my children's location without asking me." Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Marcus and James, still asleep, unbothered by the stopped car, by the strange dark outside the windows, by the fact that their lives had been relocated twice in 12 hours. Children slept like that when they felt safe. She had always been their safety. She was going to need to stay that. "We're going to finish this conversation," she said. "Not now, later." "I know," he said. "Get the boys inside." He got out and opened her door, and she lifted James, while one of the security men, careful, efficient, treating the child like something fragile, took Marcus, and they went inside through a side entrance into a house that was warm and quiet and smelled of cedar and something cooking low on a stove somewhere. And she understood that this had been prepared, that people had been here getting it ready, that Ji-hoon had planned this before he ever walked into her bookstore. She filed that away. She would examine it later. The boys' room was at the end of a ground floor corridor. 2 beds, low to the floor in the Korean style, with thick blankets and small pillows and a lamp that gave out a warm amber light. Someone had put stuffed animals on the beds. She didn't know who and didn't ask. She tucked them in and stood over them for a moment in the amber light and listened to them breathe, the synchronized rhythm of two people who had shared every night of their lives. And then she went out and closed the door softly. Ji-hoon was in the corridor. "Show me the layout," she said. "Every exit, every point of entry, every person on your security team, and what their specific role is." He showed her. It took 40 minutes. The estate was more defensible than it looked from the outside. Reinforced walls, cameras at every angle, a panic room behind the kitchen's back wall that she had to look twice to identify as a door. 8 security personnel on the property, rotating shifts, 2 always on the perimeter. The men were professional and quiet, and treated her with the specific, respectful neutrality of people who had been briefed on her status and were not going to complicate it with opinions. When the tour was finished, she went to the kitchen and poured herself water, and stood at the counter and drank it, and Ji-hoon leaned against the opposite counter and waited. "Min Seok," she said. "Tell me what he's actually planning." "A direct move. He's been consolidating men for 3 months. My intelligence says he has between 20 and 30 operatives he's moved into position." Ji-hoon's voice was flat and informational. "He knows I left the organization. He knows where the estate is because he was here 6 years ago when I acquired it. He's been waiting for me to bring something here he could use. And you brought us anyway. The alternative was leaving you exposed in Portland with no resources and a 3-day head start on his surveillance." He looked at her steadily. "Here I control the terrain. I have people I trust. In Portland you had locks and an alarm." She hated that he was right. She hated the specific, familiar clarity of his logic, the way it stripped the situation to its actual components and presented them without dressing. She had always found it useful and infuriating in equal measure. "When?" she said. "Soon. My source says within the week, possibly less now that he knows you've moved." He paused. "He'll move faster when he loses your Portland location. So we wait for him to come to us. We prepare," he said. "And yes." She put down the water glass. The kitchen clock said 4:47 a.m. Outside, through the high windows, the mountain dark was beginning its slow surrender to early gray. "I want a weapon," she said. Something moved in his face. Not surprise. He didn't surprise easily, but a recalibration. "Amara, I'm not going to sit in a panic room and wait to find out how things go. If something comes through the perimeter and gets to that corridor before your people do, I want to be able to make a decision." She looked at him. "I know how to shoot. My uncle took me to a range every summer from age 12 to 18. I'm not asking you to arm me for a gunfight. I'm asking for the ability to protect my sons if everything else has already failed." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he went to a cabinet and came back with a handgun, compact, lighter than the one she had seen in his desk drawer in Seoul, a different model, and placed it on the counter between them along with a spare magazine. He walked her through the safety and the load and the action without condescension, just information, and she listened and handled it and set it down, and they looked at each other across the kitchen counter in the early gray light. "You know what this means," he said, "having this." "It means I've stopped pretending I'm a bystander," she said. "I was never actually a bystander. I was just telling myself I was." He nodded once. She picked up the gun. Sit. 3 days passed in a state of suspended tension that was its own specific kind of exhaustion. Not the sharp fear of immediate threat, but the grinding wear of waiting for something you knew was coming. Amara slept in 4-hour increments and woke fully alert both times, a new pattern her body had apparently adopted without being asked. The boys adapted to the estate with the resilience of children whose primary world was each other. They found the garden and the low stone walls and the particular acoustics of the main hall, and they ran through the corridors with the focused joy of animals released into new space, and the security men watched them with the careful blankness of professionals, and occasionally, when they thought no one was looking, with something considerably warmer. Ji-hoon was with them in the mornings. This was what she hadn't prepared for. Not the danger, not the waiting, but this. Him in the kitchen at 7, making the doenjang guy from memory. The same recipe, the same focused quiet, and the boys at the low table watching him with the frank evaluative stare of children encountering a new person in their space and running their own internal assessment. Marcus, who had her wariness, her tendency to observe before engaging, watched Ji-hoon for 2 full days before he said anything to him. James, who had apparently inherited something from his father's side, some quality of directness, of going straight at a thing, pointed at Ji-hoon on the second morning and said, "You cook the same as Mama's." Ji-hoon looked at him. Something happened in his face that he didn't control. "Your mama taught me," he said, which was not accurate, and they both knew it, but was the kind of answer that protected the question behind it, and James accepted it with the satisfaction of a child who has received an answer regardless of its precision. She watched this from the doorway. She didn't go in. On the third night, Ji-hoon came and found her on the back terrace, standing in the cold mountain air with the gun in her coat pocket and her arms folded and the dark valley below the estate lit only by the scattered lights of small farms and distant roads. He stood beside her without speaking for a minute. The cold was sharp and clean. Inside, behind the reinforced wall, her sons were sleeping. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you," she said, not looking at him, saying it to the dark valley. "I want you to know that. I left because I watched your face, and I didn't know which one was real." "Both," he said, quiet. "Both of them were real. I'm not going to tell you otherwise." She breathed out slowly. The cold took the breath and dissolved it. "I know that now. Does it change anything?" She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me when this is over." He nodded. He stayed beside her on the terrace for another 10 minutes without speaking, and she let him, because his presence in the dark was not a comfort she had asked for, but was one she was too tired to refuse. Min Seok came on the fourth night, not the fifth, not the week Ji-hoon had estimated. The fourth. At 3:17 a.m., which she knew because she was already awake, had been awake for 40 minutes, some animal instinct pulling her out of sleep without a clear reason, and she had been sitting on the edge of her bed with the gun on the nightstand when the alarm on the security panel in the corridor gave its single clip tone and then went silent, which was worse than if it had kept sounding. She was in the corridor before the second tone. Ji-hoon was already there, dressed, moving with the specific compressed efficiency of a man shifting into a different register entirely. Not the composed, measured man of kitchens and conversations, but something older and more precise, the thing underneath that she had seen once through a doorway and had run from. He looked at her and took in the gun in her hand and said, "Panic room, now." "How many?" Perimeter team counted 18 on the south approach, more coming from the east. He was already moving, already issuing low, rapid instructions in Korean to the two men at the end of the corridor. "Amara, panic room. The boys are still in their room. I know where the boys are. Go get them. I'll be right behind you." She went. She hit the boys' room at a run and had Marcus in her arms before he was fully awake. He made a sound of protest, a child's complaint about interrupted sleep, and she said, "Shh, shh, come here," and grabbed James with the other arm, both of them heavy and warm and disoriented, and she carried them out into the corridor where Ji-hoon materialized exactly as he had said he would. And he took Marcus from her without asking, just lifted him and carried him with the certainty of a man who had decided this was his and was not looking for permission, and they moved together down the corridor to the kitchen and through the door she had studied 3 days ago and now needed. The panic room was concrete and steel behind its false wall, 12 by 12, a bench along each side, a monitor system showing 8 camera feeds, a medical kit, water, a radio. She put James down on the bench. Ji-hoon put Marcus beside him. Both boys were awake now, awake and looking between their mother and this man with the wide-eyed silence of children who understood that something serious was happening and were waiting to be told how to feel about it. Ji-hoon crouched in front of them. He looked at Marcus first, then James. He held their gaze and did not look away, and did not make his face false or bright in the way of adults trying to manage children's fear. He looked at them the way he looked at everything that mattered, directly, with full attention. "You're going to stay in here with your mama," he said, low and even. "The door locks from inside. No one can open it but her. You stay quiet, and you stay with her, and you don't open the door for anyone except me." He looked at them both. "Can you do that?" Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. James said, "Are you going to fight?" Ji-hoon held his son's eyes. "Yes." "Are you going to win?" A beat. "Yes." James considered this with the gravity of a 3-year-old conducting a serious assessment. Then he nodded too. Ji-hoon stood. He looked at Amara. In the gray light of the panic room, his face was the face she had first known. Still, watchful, giving nothing away. But she could read him now in ways she couldn't then. And what she read was not cold and was not nothing. It was the face of a man going towards something he might not come back from and making peace with that before he went. She put her hand on his arm. "Come back," she said. He covered her hand with his for 1 second. Then he was gone, and the door sealed behind him, and she was alone with her sons and 8 camera feeds showing the estate in the green-gray of night vision. She sat between the boys and pulled them close and watched the screens. It started on the south feed. Movement at the tree line, fast and organized, men moving in formation with the specific discipline of people who had done this before. She counted. 12 on the south approach, spread wide to prevent easy containment. On the east feed, more movement. She couldn't count them. The camera angle showed the access road and then the wall and then the dark beyond it, and the dark was full of things moving. Ji-hoon's men met them at the south wall. What happened next was not like the movies. It was faster and less legible and more brutal. Not a choreographed sequence, but a collapse of order, bodies moving in and out of camera frame, muzzle flashes like stuttering light, the sound of it reaching the panic room as a muffled percussion she felt more than heard. Marcus pressed his face into her side. She put her arm around him and kept her eyes on the screens. On the north feed, the one showing the garden side of the estate, she saw Ji-hoon. He moved along the garden wall with 2 of his men, flanking toward the east approach, where the secondary force was breaching. She watched him and felt something cold and clarifying move through her. The specific sensation of watching a person you loved operate in a context where love was entirely beside the point. He was precise and fast and completely without hesitation. And the man who had knelt on a bathroom tile saying all of us was the same man on the screen and also entirely different, and she was finally watching him, done trying to resolve the contradiction. It was not a contradiction. It was a person. People contained more than one true thing. She had known this in theory for her entire adult life, and it had taken 3 years in a panic room in a Korean mountain estate for it to stop being theory. James had fallen back asleep somehow, impossibly, the way very young children could. Marcus was awake and quiet, and she kept her arm around him and her eyes on the screens. On the south feed, 2 of Ji-hoon's men were down, not moving. She stared at the screen and told herself to breathe. On the east feed, Ji-hoon's group made contact with the secondary force, and the camera feed stuttered. Something hit the east wall, impact close enough to affect the camera mount. And when it steadied, Ji-hoon was still moving, still upright, still functional, and the east approach was beginning to break. Then the south feed showed something that stopped her breathing entirely. A man moving separately from the main assault group, not with the others, coming from a different angle, diagonal, toward the main building rather than the wall. He was larger than the others. He moved with the confidence of a man who was not part of the assault team, but above it. Not a soldier, a principal. She had never seen Cha Min-seok in person. She didn't need to have seen him. The way he moved said everything about what he was and what he thought of himself. He was heading for the side entrance, the one she had come through 4 nights ago. She looked at the door of the panic room. Sealed. Ji-hoon had said no one could open it from outside. She believed him. She made herself believe him and kept her eyes on the screen and watched Min-seok reach the side entrance and try the door and find it locked and stand there for a moment, calculating. Then he looked up at the camera, directly at it, as if he knew someone was watching. He smiled. She felt the smile in her chest like a cold hand closing. On the other feeds, the main assault was breaking. Ji-hoon's people had the numbers contained on both the south and east, and the fight's energy was changing, the organized advance disintegrating into something less controlled. She could see it even on the small screens, the shift from offensive pressure to defensive scramble. They were losing. Min-seok's people were losing. But Min-seok himself was not retreating. He stood at the locked side entrance and looked at the camera for another 5 seconds. Then he reached into his coat and held up a phone, showing it to the camera, showing it to whoever was watching, and dialed. Her phone buzzed. She stared at it. It buzzed again. Marcus looked up at her. She squeezed his shoulder once, kept her face neutral, and answered. "I know you're watching, Min-sok said. His English was accented but precise. Call him off. Tell Kong to stand down and I walk away. No more of this. Clean ending. Her voice came out level. You're talking to the wrong person. I'm talking to the person he'll listen to. A pause. You're smarter than this situation, Miss Okoye. You left once because you understood what he was. You know how this ends if he wins tonight. More blood, more nights in panic rooms. This doesn't stop. Not with me, not with the next one. It never stops for men like him. She looked at Marcus. She looked at the gun on the bench beside her. She looked at the screen showing Ji-hoon on the east side of the estate, moving now toward the south to reinforce, not knowing yet that Min-seok was at the side entrance. You should have stayed in Portland, Min-seok said. That was your way out. A pause, and she heard something shift in his voice, something that had been reasonable going sharp. This is you choosing to burn with him. I didn't call you, she said. You called me. That means you need something I have. Silence. You need him to stop, she said. You're losing out there and you know it, and you came to the door because a direct call to Ji-hoon doesn't get you what you want. He'd never stand down, not for himself. So you called me. She kept her voice absolutely flat. That means you already know the answer to your own question. You already know what I'm going to say. A long pause. You're making a mistake, he said. I've made bigger ones, she said, and I'm still here. She ended the call. She switched the radio to the security channel and keyed it and said, Southside entrance. He's at the southside entrance. Alone. 3 seconds of static. Then Ji-hoon's voice, rough and slightly winded. Copy. Stay inside. He's alone, she said again. His people are breaking. He came to the door. A pause. She could hear movement through the radio, the crunch of his footsteps on ground, the specific acoustic of the outdoor mountain air. Stay inside, he said again. Harder this time. Do not open that door. I hear you, she said. She put down the radio. She looked at the south feed. Min-seok was still at the door. He had put the phone away. He was looking at the camera again, and his face now had the expression of a man who has made a calculation and arrived at a conclusion he is not happy with but will act on regardless. And he reached into his coat with his left hand and brought out something she recognized, and she felt the specific cold clarity of understanding what happened next before it happened. And she pulled Marcus close and turned him away from the screen and put her body between her son and the monitor and pressed her lips to the top of his head and held the gun in her right hand with the safety off and watched the door and waited for the sound that would tell her whether Ji-hoon had reached the entrance in time or whether the next 30 seconds were going to require her to find out what she was made of in a way she had never tested before. And the mountain estate was full of the sound she had been waiting for came at 3:51 a.m. Not the door. Not Min-seok breaching the entrance. A single shot. Close. Close enough that she felt the concussion of it more than heard it. A pressure change in the air that Marcus felt too because he flinched against her side and made a sound low in his throat. Then silence. Then the specific silence that followed something final, that had a different texture than the silence before it, heavier and more settled. She held Marcus and held the gun and watched the door and counted her own heartbeats. 12, 13, 14. The radio crackled. It's done, Ji-hoon's voice, rougher than before. Something in it that told her things she wasn't ready to catalog yet. Don't open the door until I knock. 3 times. She exhaled. Marcus pulled back and looked at her face with the direct assessment of a child reading the adult who was his primary data source for the state of the world. She made her face tell him the right thing. Not false brightness, not performed calm, but actual information. It's over. We're safe. You can breathe. He read it and leaned back against her, and she felt his body release some of the tension it had been holding, the small architecture of a child's fear carefully dismantling itself. James was still asleep. She looked at her younger son, his face slack and trusting in the monitor's dim light, one fist curled under his chin, the way he had slept since the NICU, and felt something enormous and wordless move through her. Gratitude was too small a word for it. Survival was closer, but still not right. It was more specific than either of those things. It was the feeling of looking at what you had protected and finding it intact. 3 knocks. She stood. She went to the door and put her hand on the release and stopped. Ji-hoon, she said. Yes. His voice on the other side, close. It's me. She opened the door. He was leaning against the corridor wall with his right hand pressed to his left side, and the hand was dark. She registered this in the first second and felt the adrenaline spike that the last hour had not managed to produce. Sharper than fear, more specific, the terror of a particular person being damaged rather than the general terror of threat. His face was composed, but the composition was costing him. He was upright. He had come to the door himself. She looked at the hand and the side and told herself to function. How bad, she said. Through and through. Ribs, maybe one? I need... Sit down, she said. He sat down on the corridor floor with the controlled descent of a man managing significant pain with significant determination, and she went back into the panic room for the medical kit and came out and knelt beside him and opened his shirt and looked at what was there. Entry and exit, as he'd said. The exit was worse, the way they always were, a tear rather than a hole, bleeding steadily but not the dark arterial surge that meant the worst kind of damage. She had no medical training beyond a first aid certification she'd renewed every year since starting teaching, which was not nothing and was also nowhere near enough, but it was what was available. She worked. She packed the wound with gauze from the kit and applied pressure, and he sat against the wall and breathed and did not make a sound, which she found both admirable and infuriating. His security team materialized in the corridor, 2 men, checking his condition, relaying rapid Korean into radios, and she registered them and kept working. Min Seok, she said. Dead, he said. She pressed the gauze harder than necessary. He exhaled through his teeth. Tell me how. He came through the side door after the call, breached the lock. I met him in the service corridor. A pause for breath. He shot first. He missed. I didn't. She looked up at his face. He was looking at the ceiling. His jaw was tight with the effort of managing the pain. And something else, the specific flatness that came after, the effectless calm of a man who had done something he was accustomed to doing and felt the familiar weight of it settling. He's gone, Ji-hoon said again. Quieter this time. Not for her, for himself. It's over. She secured the dressing with the tape from the kit. It was not elegant work. It would hold until they got him somewhere with actual equipment. She sat back on her heels and looked at him and felt the entire accumulated weight of the last 4 days, the last 3 years, the last 4.5 years begin to descend. Not all at once, but in a slow, inevitable press, like a tide coming in. You need a hospital, she said. I know a doctor, discreet. He can be here in an hour. Of course he can, she said, and her voice held something dry and tired and almost something like the particular dark humor she sometimes used when she had run out of any other response to the situation she was in. He looked at her face, and something in his own face shifted. The pain still there, the flatness still there, but something alive behind it, reading her the way he always read her. Thank you, he said. For what specifically? The radio? The entrance? He paused. The call. She looked at him. He called me because he thought I'd give him what he wanted. He thought 3 years in Portland meant I was separate from this. She folded the used gauze into the kit. I'm not separate from this. I was never separate from this. I stopped pretending that somewhere around the time I got on the plane. He was quiet. That's not the same as forgiving everything, she said. I want to be clear about that. I know. There's a lot we haven't talked about. A lot I still don't... She stopped. Put the kit aside. Pressed the back of her wrist to her forehead for a moment, a gesture she made when she was processing more than she had clean language for. Not tonight. Tonight I need to get my sons through this and get you seen by your discreet doctor, and then I need to sleep for approximately 1 year. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. Something more worn than a smile, more honest. Reasonable, he said. She stood. She went back to the panic room and lifted James, who stirred and murmured and put his face against her neck without fully waking, and came back out to find Marcus standing in the corridor looking at Ji-hoon with the focused attention he brought to everything that required his serious assessment. Ji-hoon looked back at him. You're bleeding, Marcus said. A little, Ji-hoon said. Does it hurt? Yes. Marcus considered this. Then he sat down on the corridor floor beside Ji-hoon. not touching him, just beside him, with the deliberate proximity of a child making a decision about someone, and leaned his back against the wall and looked at the middle distance with the expression of a person who had decided to stay. Jihoon looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Amara. She looked back at him over James's sleeping head and felt the particular quality of a thing that had no adequate language. This corridor, these two people she had made, this man bleeding on her floor who was their father, this mountain in Korea that had somehow become the place where every thread she had been carrying finally came to rest. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. Marcus sat beside him and James breathed against her neck, and the estate was quiet, and that was enough for now. The doctor came and went before sunrise. 2 cracked ribs, the wound cleaned and properly dressed, antibiotics, strict instructions in Korean that Jihoon listened to with the unconvincing compliance of a man who intended to follow approximately 60% of what he was told. The security team cleared the estate grounds through the morning hours. Amara did not ask for a full accounting and was not given one, which was a form of consideration she accepted without comment. She slept 4 hours and woke to the sound of the boys in the kitchen and lay in the unfamiliar bed for a moment, listening to their voices and the lower sound of Jihoon answering something James had asked. And she looked at the ceiling and felt the mountain silence around the estate like a held breath finally released. She got up. In the kitchen, Jihoon was sitting at the table. Not cooking, just sitting, his movements limited by the ribs and the dressing, and the boys were eating rice with the focused application of people taking the meal seriously. Marcus had positioned himself directly across from Jihoon. James was beside Jihoon, close enough that their arms almost touched. And this proximity, chosen, deliberate, completely unprompted, was the thing she stood in the doorway looking at for a moment before anyone noticed her. Jihoon noticed her. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her with the morning on his face, tired and present and real. And she came into the kitchen and poured herself coffee and sat down at the table, and the 4 of them ate breakfast on a Korean mountain as though this were an ordinary thing that ordinary people did. It was not ordinary. She was not going to pretend it was, but it was real. And real was the only currency she had any faith in anymore. 3 days later, when Jihoon could move without the specific expression that told her each breath was a negotiation, she asked him to sit with her. They went to the back terrace, the same one where they had stood in the dark before Min-seok came, the valley below them quieter in daylight, the mountains clear and pale against a November sky. The boys were inside with 2 of the security men who had, by this point, been entirely co-opted as impromptu playmates, a development that seemed to amuse Jihoon and had produced in Marcus a profound and slightly imperious attachment to the larger of the 2. She had thought about this conversation for 3 days. She had thought about it across 3 years and 6,000 miles and 2 boys in 1 panic room. She had the shape of what she needed to say, and she was going to say it cleanly, without circling, because that was how she operated, and she had run out of patience for any other approach. "I need to know what comes next," she said. Not what you want, what actually comes next, structurally, the organization, the criminal holdings, whatever is left. He was looking at this valley. "I began the exit 18 months ago. The process is approximately 70% complete." He said it the way he said things he had thought through exhaustively, not with defensiveness, not with the energy of justification, just as fact. The remaining 30% is logistics, legitimate acquisition of the final operating assets, another 6 to 8 months. And then it's done, completely done. There will always be men who remember who I was. He looked at her. "I can't change that. What I can control is what I actually am." A pause. Min-seok was the last one with both the motivation and the resources to come at us directly. The others, the organizations I dealt with, I've negotiated an agreement, permanent. Your name and the boys' names are untouchable. In exchange, I relinquish every remaining claim to territory, revenue, and standing. She looked at him. "You gave up everything." "I gave up a business I should have exited a decade ago." He looked back at the valley. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it. Not grief exactly, not regret exactly, but the particular weight of a man accounting for himself honestly. "I stayed because I didn't have a reason to leave. Then I had reasons." He didn't look at her when he said it. He didn't need to. She was quiet for a moment. The mountain air was cold and clean, and the valley below was going about its ordinary business, farms and roads, and the small, visible lives of people who had nothing to do with any of this. "The man in the office," she said, "in Seoul, Park Hyun-tae." "Yes, I've been carrying that image for 3 years. The look on your face." She looked at her hands on the railing. "I understand now what he was, and what you did, and why. I understood it when you told me in the bookstore." She stopped, started again. "What I needed to understand, what I've been working through, is that I can understand it and still have needed to leave. Both of those things can be true." "They are both true," he said. "You're not angry that I left." "No." Simple and complete. "You made the only decision you could make with what you had. I read your letter 100 times. You didn't leave because you stopped believing in me. You left because you were afraid of what it would cost your children to stay." He turned to look at her then. "I spent 3 years trying to become the answer to that fear. Whether I've managed it isn't for me to decide." She looked at him. In the morning light, he was older than the man she had married in a cold transaction in a Chicago hotel suite, and the age was not subtraction. It was addition, the accumulation of everything he had been through and done and chosen and paid for. She knew this face. She knew it better than she had known any face except her son's. "I'm not ready to be married to you again," she said. He held her gaze without flinching. "I know. I'm not saying never. I'm saying not yet. I need time that isn't a crisis. I need to know what it looks like when nothing's on fire." She looked away. "I need you to be in my son's lives without that being contingent on what happens between us. Those are separate things." "They've always been separate things," he said quietly. "I should have said that more clearly before now." She nodded. "We're going to stay," she said, "in Korea, for now. The boys, they should know where they come from, half of where they come from." She paused. "I want to open a bookstore. I've been planning it for years and I keep not doing it, and I'm done not doing it." Something happened in his face. Small and controlled, but she caught it. The specific thing he did when something mattered more than he was going to say. "Tell me what you need," he said. "Nothing from you financially. I have enough to start." She held up a hand at whatever he was going to say. "That's not pride talking. That's me needing to build something that's mine. You can support it in other ways when I ask you to." "When you ask," he said. "When I ask." He nodded, and then he said nothing more about it, which was exactly right, which was the Ji-hoon she had learned and left and was now, slowly and without ceremony, beginning to map again from the beginning. What? The bookstore opened the following spring on a narrow street in Mapo, close enough to the Han that on clear days she could see the river from the second-floor window where she had put her writing desk and her mother's photograph and a small shelf of the books she had carried across 2 countries in 3 years. She called it Okoye's, because she had earned the right to put her name on something and she was going to use it. The boys started at an international school in September. Marcus took to Korean faster than she had. He had Ji-hoon's gift for languages, which she noted without comment. James made 7 friends in his first week by the straightforward method of walking up to people and asking if they wanted to run, which turned out to be an effective approach. They were 4 years old, and they were loud, and they were entirely themselves, and they made her life both harder and more worth living than anything she had ever experienced, which she understood was the fundamental bargain of loving people. Ji-hoon was in their lives in the way she had asked for. Present without crowding, available without demanding, building something with the boys that had its own structure and pace and did not require her management or permission. He came to the bookstore on Saturday mornings and sat at the reading table with a coffee and read to whichever children had gathered, including her sons, in a low, even voice that turned out to be very good for stories. She watched him do this through the doorway of her office and felt the complicated warmth of it without trying to name it precisely. Her father came to visit in October. He spent 2 weeks, and on the 4th day, Ji-hoon came to dinner, and the 3 of them sat at the table after the boys were in bed, and her father looked at Ji-hoon across the remains of the meal and said, with the directness of a man who had run out of patience for his own evasions, "My daughter gave up 3 years of her life because of choices I made. You understand that?" "Yes," Ji-hoon said. And you understand what that cost her. I understand what I know of it. I imagine I don't know all of it." Her father looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, the particular nod of a man not offering forgiveness but acknowledging the weight of a thing. "The boys like you," he said. "I know. That matters more than what I think." "What you think matters too," Ji-hoon said. "You're their grandfather." Her father was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his glass and held it slightly toward Ji-hoon in a gesture that was not quite a toast but was adjacent to one, an acknowledgement, an opening, a door left ajar rather than swung wide. Ji-hoon met it with his own glass. They drank. She looked at the two of them across her dinner table and felt something she had no precise word for. Not happiness, or not only happiness, but the specific quality of a moment that had been earned rather than given, that carried in it the full cost of everything that had come before. A year after the estate. November again, the same cold, the Han gone gray and wide beneath a sky without character. She was closing the bookstore on a Thursday evening, the last customer gone, the lights down to the reading lamp she always left on in the children's corner because she liked coming in the morning to find it still burning. She was at the front window turning the sign when she saw Ji-hoon across the street. He wasn't waiting for anything, it seemed. He was just standing there with his hands in his coat pockets looking at the bookstore the way she had seen him look at things that mattered to him. Completely, without performance, just the real looking of a man who wasn't managing his own face. She opened the door. He looked at her. The street was quiet between them, the cold moving down from the north, the river smell in the air. "Were you going to knock?" she said. "I was deciding," he said. She leaned against the doorframe. "And?" He crossed the street. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the details of his face in the lamplight from inside. The lines that had been added, the steadiness that had always been there. The specific and particular way he looked at her that she had spent years trying to make herself indifferent to and had never once managed. He reached into his coat pocket. He brought out a ring, not elaborate, not a declaration, a simple gold band with a small dark stone. The kind of thing a person chose because it was real rather than because it was impressive. He held it in his open palm between them. "Not a contract," he said. "Not an arrangement. No terms." He held her gaze. "Just me asking." She looked at the ring. She looked at his face. She thought about a Chicago kitchen at 4 in the morning and a hotel suite and 14 hours over the Pacific and a penthouse overlooking the Han and a bathroom tile and a panic room and a Portland bookstore and a mountain estate and a Tuesday night in November on a quiet street in Mapo with the river smell in the air and her name on the door behind her. She had made every consequential decision of the last 5 years with her eyes open. She had made them in full knowledge of the cost and paid every part of it and been changed by the pain in ways she was still discovering. She was not the woman who had signed a contract in a lawyer's office. She was not the woman who had packed a bag before dawn in a Seoul penthouse. She was not the woman who had built a careful, contained life in Portland and called it safety. She was all of those women and none of them exclusively, and the person she was now had been made by every version of the choice. She was 32 years old. She had 2 sons who called her mama with the absolute confidence of people who had never once doubted the fixed point. She had a bookstore with her name on it. She had her mother's ring on her right hand and her mother's photograph on the desk upstairs. And the rocking chair was still on her father's porch in Englewood and would be there whenever she needed to see it. She looked at Ji-hoon and felt what she felt and did not talk herself out of it because she had spent enough years managing what she felt and she was done with that particular effort. She took the ring from his palm. She put it on her left hand herself, which was not how he had intended it, but which was, she thought, exactly right. She had chosen it, she had placed it, it was hers. He looked at her hand, then at her face. Something in him settled, a long tension releasing, the specific quality of a man who has been waiting for something for a long time and had given up expecting to feel this. "Come in," she said. "I'll make tea." He came inside. She turned off the reading lamp and locked the door, and they went upstairs to the small room above the bookstore where the river was visible through the window, and she put the kettle on and he sat at the table and they talked the way they had learned to talk, about the boys, about her father's health, about the shipping contract he was negotiating, about the novel she was reading, about ordinary things in the ordinary language of 2 people who had survived something together and come out the other side, and were now, with great care and no illusions, building something in the space the surviving had made. Outside, Soul moved and breathed and didn't stop for anything. Inside the small room above the bookstore, the kettle began to steam. The following spring, she found out she was pregnant. She sat on the edge of the bathroom counter, their bathroom now, the apartment 2 floors above the bookstore that they had moved into in February, and looked at the test and felt not shock, but the quiet, specific inevitability of a thing that made complete sense. One line, then two, the same as before, the same counting of something new beginning. She thought about what to feel and decided not to manage it. She just felt it, the weight and the wonder and the slight hilarity of the universe's apparent commitment to its own narrative, and then she put down the test and went to the kitchen where Ji-hoon was making breakfast and stood in the doorway and waited until he looked up from the stove and read her face. He read it in approximately 2 seconds. He put down the spoon. She watched his face do the thing it had done in a different bathroom 4 years ago. The stillness, the landing, the thing beneath it that he had no control over, the realness of a man feeling something true. He crossed the kitchen. He put both hands on her face and looked at her and said nothing, which was the right thing. From the boys' room came the sound of Marcus and James in the middle of their morning argument about something that was both completely serious and entirely unimportant. The rhythmic noise of 2 people who had been together since before they had language and had never once figured out how to stop talking to each other. Ji-hoon's hands were warm on her face. She put her hands over his. Outside, the Han River was running high with spring water, gray-green and wide, running toward the sea the way it always had, indifferent to everything and continuous through all of it. And in the room above the bookstore on a spring morning, a family that had been made from a disaster was simply alive, which was not a small thing, which had in fact been the hardest thing any of them had ever done. Their daughter was born in October. They named her Seo Rin, for a grandmother who had cooked the same stew every Sunday and believed that care had a language that didn't require translation. She came into the world loudly and immediately, as though she had things to accomplish and saw no reason to wait. Her father held her first, while Amara recovered, and she watched him from the bed, his hands so careful around something so small, his face entirely without armor. And she thought about a contract signed in a lawyer's office, and thought about everything that contract had cost and made and broken and rebuilt. And she thought about her mother's rocking chair and her father's Sunday calls and Mrs. Park's expression of profound satisfaction, and a kitchen in Seoul at 3 in the morning, and a mountain estate, and a ring she had placed on her own hand on a November street. She thought about all of it, and she held it all, and she did not try to resolve it into something clean or simple, because it was not clean or simple, and the trying would have been a lie, and she was done with lies, including the comfortable ones. Ji-hoon looked up from their daughter and found Amara watching him. She smiled. He smiled back, fully, openly, the rare complete version that she had spent years working to earn and still received like something given rather than owed. In the room outside, Marcus and James were with her father, who had flown in 3 days ago and was, by all reports, telling them stories about their mother as a child with a level of embellishment that she was going to need to address later. The sound of their laughter came through the door, high and uncomplicated. The sound of children in a world that was currently safe. That was the thing she had learned in the end. Not that safety was guaranteed, not that love was without cost, not that the right choices were always clear, or that good intentions protected you from consequences. None of that was true, and she had learned it the hardest possible way. What she had learned was simpler and less comfortable and more sustaining than any of it. That you went forward anyway. That you chose anyway. That the choosing, done clear-eyed and fully awake and in full knowledge of the cost, that was not weakness and it was not naivety. It was the one thing she knew how to call by its right name. She held her daughter's name in her mouth like something precious. Seo Rin. Outside, Seoul went on.